Hi, my name is Scott, and I used to be a Mormon. When people ask me why it's used to be, my response is generally I care too much for truth and integrity and honesty to have my name affiliated with the Mormon Church, and therefore I am no longer a Mormon. And so that sometimes that statement, if it is a non-Mormon, it confuses them a little bit, just because Mormons have a mostly well-deserved um, reputation for honesty, for hard work, for being nice, um, and my issues with Mormonism don't necessarily stem from Mormons themselves. In fact, I've been fairly lucky in my life. I have a number of very good friends who are Mormons who don't seem to care or mind that I don't believe in their religion anymore. Um, they generally have good attitudes about a lot of the things that I have, and we hold very similar political views on some issues. Uh, I think my issues with Mormonism stem mostly around the Mormon doctrine, the Mormon leadership, and the historicity of the church, the historical inaccuracies, the just the historical whitewashing that I was raised to believe about the Mormon Church that turn out to be inaccurate. So, by way of bona fides, my history is that I was born in Utah to a full member, partial active, partially inactive family. I would say also probably partially believing. Um, I won't really get into it, but um, I, I don't really remember too much about attending church before I was 8, but I do remember at 8, as is traditional in the Mormon religion, I was baptized. Um, that particular day, I have a lot of good memories about that day, just because it was time spent with my father and friends from my neighborhood and my ward. But I also have some memories that aren't so great, and they revolve around how baptism is approached in general, I think, in religion, but in Mormonism specifically, in that this is a renewal, a refreshing of your life, and you're sinless before God, and all you can do from here is go down, which was exactly how I saw it at the tender age of 8. So throughout the rest of my preteen and younger teen years, I spent I would say partially active, but fully believing. Um, Raised with all the regular, normal Mormon dogma, uh, and I can't remember for sure if I was ordained into the Aaronic priesthood, which is sort of the entry level priesthood in Mormonism, at the proper age as a young teenager, or if I did it later. I can't remember for sure, but I do remember being fairly active as a young teenager, um, mostly revolving around scouting and activities, things like that are very popular in the Mormon culture, in the Utah culture. I would say even non Mormons were very active in those areas. Scouting in Utah, especially in the 70s and 80s, and before, was ran by the church almost invariably. And so, if you, even non members, were interested in participating in scouts, they would be participating in essentially church activities. But scouting has always had a tie with faith, at any rate. As I would say that as I moved into sort of slightly more advanced teenage years, and on up through high school, I was less active, maybe periodically attending. Once I married and had children, however, my spouse and I, we decided that we would be active, as is pretty typical, I think, at least of Utah folks. Even inactive people, when they have children, I think your thoughts generally start to turn to the future, and you think about how you want your kids raised. And in Mormon culture, that means raising them, as active Mormons. So we became, I would say, active. I wouldn't go as far as to say dedicated, but we were very active, very devout, very believing, held many callings, and I worked my way through the priesthood, slowly but surely, and at the ripe old age of 24, we were married in the temple. And from that point on, I feel like I feel like the temple for me really caused a split in how I saw the church. For me, I distinctly remember thinking this thought, when I went through the temple, that I had on one hand my sort of community-driven church, and it really was very much a social community thing, right? So a lot of the activities and a lot of the callings and serving and stuff like that really dealt with community. Once I went through the temple, I remember thinking, what have they done with my church? This is really strange. So I feel like, well, I really don't want to use the phrase "I feel like," but when I recall it, my feelings towards it were very much, this is very strange, this is very cringeworthy. And I remember thinking that it was very cult-like, a lot of the things that you do in the temple. I didn't know until later, and I'll go into this in some other videos. I'll go into some details about some of the things that I learned and what they are, what the history behind them are, why they are problematic. But I distinctly remember thinking that this was very strange. It was uncomfortable, specifically in the Mormon temple ceremony. As part of the Mormon ceremony, there is this idea of a washing and anointing, something that they called initiatories, if I recall correctly. And when I went through the temple, now this is not the case anymore, so this is just another one of the many things that have changed over the years, which you will find. When I was raised, we were told that things never changed. God was the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, you'll be gaslit by Mormons nowadays, and they'll tell you, oh, we knew that changed. They didn't know that it changed, unless they witnessed it, before and after the change. But at any rate, when I went through, you essentially stripped naked, and you put a really strange carpet over your head with a hole in it for your head. I've heard it referred to as a poncho, although I wouldn't really call it a poncho. To me, it really was kind of like a carpet runner that they had just cut a hole in it for your head, and it kind of draped down the back of you and down the front of you. But your sides were completely open. And this was, men and women were not together, in at least you couldn't see each other. Um, but you took all your clothes off and you put this poncho on, and then some old dude. And you went into this. A lot of temples I know had like little closets or little rooms. The temple that I went through, which was the Salt Lake Temple, they just had things curtained off. So there was a lot of little curtained rooms that they had created just with curtains, little rooms that they had created with curtains. You sat down, and some old dude came in and rubbed oil in various places on you and your crotch, and I mean like kind of on your thighs, but too close to your crotch, and your whatever forehead, all sorts of places. Anyway, really really strange stuff. Very very uncomfortable, unnecessary. At any rate, that was one of the things that I had issues with. I'll get it. Like I said, I'll go into a lot more detail in some other videos, but suffice it to say that for me, that was sort of the split in the church. After that, we stayed active for quite a number of years. After that, I would say my wife a lot more than me, but periodically I would hold callings, and I would remain going to church for a while, but it didn't last forever. And as years went on, I became less and less active. I think that basically over the next about 20 years or so, maybe even 23 or 4 years, I sort of vacillated back and forth between active and inactive, and then eventually just straight up Jack Mormon, what is colloquially referred to as Jack Mormon. And I've heard the Jack reference in reference to Catholic and some other things, so I'm sure that that's not just a Utah speak. But at any rate, yeah, no, I was admittedly so openly Jack Mormon for probably the last 5 or 6 years or so. Uh, then sort of late last year, late in 2017, early 2018. Just due to some issues, I began to do a little bit more research into things. Now, I had done some previous research into the temple ceremony for Mormons just because it was so problematic for me, and it was one of the things that really sort of led me to a point where I knew that there was things about this church that I didn't like at all, and things about it that I thought were very problematic. But I had sort of just locked them away, dealt with the cognitive dissonance that they created, and as stated previously, part of dealing with that was moving to sort of inactive and active at various times. But so I had done a little bit of research. I would say probably early 2000s, something along those lines, on the temple ceremony itself, and had really kind of discovered that it was basically a wholesale ripoff of the Freemason temple ceremony. Some things added, some things changed, but by and large, it's very obvious if you look at both of them, from the clothing to what you do in there to what you say in there, that it is they're both derived from the same thing. The Mormon temple ceremony clearly derives from the Freemason temple ceremony. That is to say. But this kind of sat in the back of my mind for a number of years, and then, as stated, about 2017, late in 2017, early 2018, I started doing a little research into the church itself. This kind of led me to Reddit. So I came to this really late in life. A lot of people sort of think about these things a little earlier in their lives. I'm a middle-aged guy in my mid-40s, and so I feel like I sort of late to this particular party. But I did get there, and I'm happy that I got there eventually. But what it led me to was sort of a kind of two different things. It led me to do a lot of research on the Mormon Church and its history, and then it also led me to do a lot of research on religion and religious ideologies in general. And what that led me to was a number of YouTube communities, Reddit communities, these types of things. And I've sort of gone into details about the temple ceremony itself. For me, that was a really big one. That once I did some proper research into it, and discovered that it really is just a ripoff of the Freemason temple ceremony. That for me was really problematic. Um, that sort of led me to do research into a lot of the history of the church. So as a Mormon, I never knew anywhere near as much about the history of the Mormon Church and the people that made up the Mormon Church in its beginnings. I never knew anywhere near as much as I did as a Mormon as I do now as an ex-Mormon, about the history of the church and about the people that make up the history of the church. And the reason behind that is you'll find anytime that you deal with anything that is negative about the church, anything that casts any person, any doctrine, anything about the church itself in any kind of negative light, you will find that the majority of Mormons will essentially stick their fingers in their ear and yell Satan. Um, I want to paint that picture for you because in reality, that's really what they're doing. What they really will do is they will tell you that Satan has his grips on you, that Satan's whispering in your ear, just all sorts of absolutely silly statements, very infantilized statements, um, which is strange because your Mormons in general, at least in my experience, are very pro education, very pro research. It's just that it's very much the cult behavior of any type of research or reading videos, anything that is critical of the church, they label as anti-Mormon, regardless of the source. There are a lot of things that there are a lot of problems with the history of the church that I was taught differently, that you can find on LDS.org in the what they call the essays, and you can find them in various books and magazines and stuff. Things that are sourced by the church themselves, or at least were at some point, or sourced by previous general authorities, previous members of the church leadership, that kind of thing. You can find and validate almost every issue that I have with the church from those areas. And when I point this out to members, in general, the response I get is, "Oh, I knew that all along. I knew all about that." And it's this gaslighting that church members do. And again, I don't have an issue with members, and I did this myself, and I understand why members do this. My issues are really with the history of the church, the leadership, the doctrine. And so this gaslighting, I think, comes from that dealing with the sunk cost fallacy. So as a Mormon, you give as an active member in good standing, you are going to have a calling or multiple callings, and that entails you spending time either on Sunday or on other days, or possibly both, dedicating your time unpaid to the church. You are going to have responsibilities at church, during church. You're going to have responsibilities in your family that deal with church. You're going to spend a large portion of your time in church activities, and you are going to donate 10% of your income to the church. Again, these are things that if you are not doing, you're not a member in good standing, which means you don't hold a temple recommend. You can't participate in all of the blessings of the church. And so if this is the case, I feel like as a person who hears these things, I feel like they kind of go through the sunk cost fallacy membrane in your brain, and they just kind of sink back into somewhere in your brain. And if you're a reader of the Mormon Reddit, of the ex-Mormon Reddit channel, excuse me, the analogy that's used on there is that they're things that you sort of put on a shelf in your mind somewhere, and they just slowly crack that shelf. And eventually that shelf is just going to crack, and all of those things are going to come tumbling out. But I feel like that's sort of how that gaslighting takes place. And it's one of the reasons why I tend not to get too irritated by Mormons when they do this, because I kind of see that process happening for them, just like it happened for me with the temple issues. So I see these things, coming into their mind when I mention things, like the church history. So we'll take one of the specific things for me. One of the specific issues was that the church founder, Joseph Smith, was inarguably a criminal pedophile. The man had a criminal record. It was petty criminal, but a criminal nonetheless. And he married and most assuredly had sex with underage girls, 14-year-old girls. And as well, and even if that's not the case, he sent men on missions and then married their wives. So these are some of the things. And when I say this, for me growing up in the church, I never even realized Joseph Smith participated in polygamy at all, let alone that was the reason why he burned down a newspaper. He actually did that because they were printing stories about him participating in polygamy. This was before he came out with the convenient revelation that essentially allowed him to participate in polygamy. So at any rate, when I say these things and then to Mormons, and then they return to me the statement resembling, "Oh, I knew that already." I grew up in the church. I studied church history according to the church. I listened to all the dramatized church history. I read church history books. I didn't know any of that. They didn't cover any of that stuff. I don't know where they learned it, but I didn't learn it when I was in the church and when I was active. So I know that when I say these things and I get that statement returned to me, I know that what they're doing is they're just kind of letting that go onto the shelf, and then from there sort of coming up with a statement that kind of lets them just put it aside and not deal with it right now. And again, like I said, it's that sunk cost fallacy. They've spent all of this money and all of this time in their lives dedicated towards this cult, and it's embarrassing. I am embarrassed that I was taken in by. I hesitate to call it such an obvious cult or hoax. However, to somebody who exists outside of it, it really is pretty obvious, especially if they are willing to put in any kind of effort towards doing any kind of research on the history of the church. A lot of people I feel come into the church in the capacity of a convert, of a conversion, ignorant. They essentially only have the information that's given to them by missionaries. And when somebody only has that, and then they are told to go and perform sessions of confirmation bias by praying for the answer, it's hard to see. And I also feel like if you're born into it, it's hard to see. So while I feel like I have sort of a good excuse for not, or for being taken in by it, it still is embarrassing, nonetheless, to have paid all that money and to have dedicated that amount of time of my life towards something that is just obviously a hoax, a cult. It's just embarrassing. Anyway, to kind of get back to it and wrap this up, I after doing a lot of research into the church, and essentially finding that every single unique Mormon doctrine had some kind of analog at the time when it was created that was available to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and the other early leaders of the church. And to find all of the things in the church history that are just ugly and are either hidden or whitewashed over, that did it for me. I was done with the church, and in one last thing that I sort of want to cover, which is that in the Mormon church, they don't state this out loud, but if you go into a class, at least when I was raised in the church, when I was active, other churches were considered the whore of Babylon, basically. They were considered apostate churches. They did not have all of the truth, and not only did they not have all of the truth, but they taught lies as well. And so for me, coming from the Mormon church, where every other religion is completely false, it was really, really very easy for me to step from all of the other religions are completely false, and this religion is a cult and completely false. It was very easy for me to step into atheism, to understand that religious ideology is nothing more than something to allow people to have power over other people, to extract resources at the cost of some imaginary future after you're dead reward. And I made it to a point about, I would say, fall of last year, that essentially religion makes me sick. And I have varying degrees of disgust for most religions. But obviously my favorite religion to hate is my own personal religion, that I used to hold as true, and that extracted so much of my life, so many of my resources. So when people ask me, why can't I leave the church alone? Why can't I just go on my merry way? Well, that's why. For me, the church does a lot of evil in the world. I would say that because the church is so small and insignificant, that my interests are quickly expanding out to other religions and other dogmas, other ideologies. So I think I will probably have videos on that, but I'm going to take on some of the more detail-oriented things about the Mormon Church first. So please expect further videos from me detailing things that I have issues with in the Mormon religion and how I came to the decision to leave the Mormon Church. But for now, thank you very much for watching. And if you're interested in hearing anything from me in the future, please feel free to subscribe. And until next time.